Hello, welcome to my presentation. My name is Jozef Sivák. I'm student at Academy of Arts in Banská Bystrica in Slovakia, and I'm studying now with Slovakian guitarist Adam Marec. I would like to present several conclusions which I made during study my dissertation thesis, which is about composer and performer in one creative personality. Music is kind of art that has to be interpreted, which will provide additional creative artistic impulses made by interpreter. The performer should not only be the executor of author's will, but author's thoughts and intentions should be interpreted by performer as his own, which could be enriched by performer's individual talent. This self-realization of interpreter is not excluded with the realization of others' ideas. Of course, the composer can be the executor of his own work. This combination of composer and performer in one person can result in the most interesting interpretation of the work. However, the author does not always have to be the best as an instrumentalist, because he exhausts his creativity in a certain way in the composition process. As we said, the composer may not always be the best performer of his work if his technical possibilities do not allow him to express himself sufficiently. The opposite side, the performer may not always understand the composer's intent, although technically the performance may be perfect. For example, Rolf Lislevant, Baroque guitarist and lutenist, commented on the cover of one of his CD with Johannes Kapsberger music. He said, "Kapsberger was a bad composer, as he was a fine instrumentalist. The ideas are often badly developed and are freely associated with one another. No real musical discourse is built up. The rhythm, even after serious efforts at fathoming it, wavers between inspired cleverness and total confusion." From a historical point of view, in a later period, the roles of performer and composer are separated with the increasing difficulty of the compositional process and subsequently also interpretive demands. And therefore, it's not surprisingly that an author who may not have mastered the instrument as well as the performer leaves the interpretation to a professional performer. The role of performer can bring some risks. We came to the question of importance of a live performer in the interpretation of work. Shouldn't a musical work contain all the composer's intentions already in the written score? And shouldn't the interpretation take place just by playing, like generating the sound from the score? With technological development, of course, it is also possible to exclude the person of performer, which fortunately was proved to be a non-conventional way of interpretation. What led to the consideration of excluding the performer was the willfulness of performer. We all know these changes of original compositions made by performer himself without the author's consent, not respecting the author's intention in the first place, by changing notation, tempo, dynamics, inserting new passages to the works. The correctness of this interpretation is considerable. We can tell is a kind of interpretation, but it also depends on the performer's state and education, how this interpretation will be accepted by the audience. But there are also composers who leave their artistic intentions in a certain way to the performer. We can justify this is the author's way of discovering other ways of interpreting his work, or a way of getting inspiration from an artist. In this time from performer. Yeah. However, what constitutes the art of interpretation is not only changes in tempo or dynamics or notation, but interpretation is the smallest detail specific to the interpretation of particular player. Also, what is too explicit and obvious in the performance is replicable or copyable. For example, to imitate an interpretation that we had the opportunity to hear. But what constitutes a valuable performance is not copyable, is inimitable. It consists of the most subtle changes in the rhythm, phrasing, color, which are given by performer in a specific time, also in specific mental state. Of course, a lot of depends on the composition itself, how far the composer went with the technical difficulty, color or expressiveness needed to express his intention. In opposite way, the interpreter, however great he is, his main goal should be to penetrate as deeply as possible into the author's intention and present the work to the audience without being distorted by unnecessary self-presentation. When we take how many variable values composition contains, we get an infinity of possible interpretations. Only when we take the time in which the author and performer live. For example, in the Romantic period, when Bach was rediscovered, The interpretation is not the subject of stylistic correctly interpretation, but interpretation underline nuances of that particular period. Composer who is also performer of his own work can have advantage because the sound of the instrument is close to him. He knows intimately not only the dynamic possibilities but also color, technical possibilities, technical difficulties of instrument, but also some specific things like degree of stress during the concert performance while playing specific sections, also technical variability of played passages. We can give an example of John Corliano's guitar concert. John Corliano is an American composer. He wrote a guitar concert for Sharon Isbin. She mentions the difficulty of scale run, which is found several times in this piece. Corliano wished the guitar started its part of the stage, and during the opening run, the performer should step onto the stage from behind the scenes. Corliano wants to emphasize the arrival of music as from another surreal world into the reality. Being a composer and performer in one person can also be limiting. The composer does not think about the possibilities of instrument in a broader context. A composer who does not master the guitar does not know all the technical possibilities perfectly, but paradoxically he's not limited by this knowledge. But the composition must then be consulted with the performer. We all know this trend where composition is a natural part of guitarists' life, persist until end of 19th century and beginning of the 20th century in personalities like Tarek, Arkas, Jobe, Puchol. 20th century present a different approach to interpretation. The focus is on study of interpretation as a music department. Guitarists strive to bring stylistic purity, technical excellence, and high degree of musicality to their performances. There is a greater differentiation in these professions, performer and composer. The performer acted as an accelerator in the musical composition. Probably the best example are two exceptional performers. Without the guitar would not be in the position of a concert instrument in the 20th century, and we all know these personalities, Andres Segovia and Julian Bream, because they are often asked. They often ask the other composers to write some very important pieces. I want to share with you several conclusions based on conversations with this kind of artist, this composer and performer in one personality. One of them I spoke with is Marco Ramelli, Italian guitarist currently based in Dublin. Interesting fact is that he came from a kind of a different world. He was a computer scientist, then later he switched to be a full-time artist. What leads him to be also a composer, not only the performer, was the fact that interpretive practice, including preparation for rehearsals, concerts, competitions, was not enough for him. He wanted to be personally involved in a creative process or process of creation. What encouraged him to be a composer was a meeting with Japanese sculptor Kenjiro Azuma. Ramely describes this meeting very nicely by his own words. When I met him, he was quite old. He sees that younger people are living in the mist, they cannot see the future. He sees that element like something positive. If you don't see your future, you can start imagine. If you don't see your path, you can start imagine the path. If you see your path, you just follow it. About interpretation, for Ramely is extremely important that interpreter is not only honest with himself, but also to be honest in relation to interpreted score and the composer's intention. When I asked if he includes the performer's abilities in his compositions, he answers that he always composes for someone. Ramely does not think about the technical possibilities of the performer, but rather about the nature of interpretation itself, which suits the best for a given guitarist. Performer is really part of composing in Ramely's case. Guitarist is confronted with the sketches of the composition. After that, there is often improvisation. After hearing, the author finds inspiration in guitarist's playing and start to imaginate the other parts of the composition. Improvisation is also part of composition in Ramely's case. For Ramely, improvisation is something that can always enrich the composition, to bring something new, something over which we may not have such a conscious control. How Ramely sees composer and performer practice. Surprisingly, he said that a composer is the one who does not necessarily know his composition best. He must also study the rhythm composition like any other performer. As he humorously remarked, the only thing that makes a composer performer different from only performer is that the composer performer has a free hand in changing something. He gives an example of his composition interpreted by himself, but also interpreted by Lorenzo Micheli. He said, maybe if I played at the concert this piece after listening to Lorenzo, something will change. However, Ramely finds his inspirations retrospectively. Usually the subject of composition is identical to his current work. For example, a study of Catalan author Roberto Gerhard led him to writing of a composition dedicated to his mentor Andrea Dieci. Ramely used the compositional elements and techniques that was also used by Gerhard in that composition, which gives us an idea how the inspirational channel between the author and the source of inspiration works. Guitar is for Ramely very prone to creative atmosphere, and there are many compositions in which the sound painting of the instrument dominates over difficult compositional work. For example, just the different types of tuning that guitar can have, either color techniques. Also, in his work, in his composition Im Nebel, where it discusses the relationship between sound and silence. Also, there are some compositions written for Marco Ramely as an interpreter. One of the piece which is written for Marco Ramely is the piece called Vento de Inverno, or Winter Wind, from Marco de Biasi. Marco de Biasi is also composer and performer. And this piece was written as an exchange between these two composers, which they wrote for each other. This piece was a very short piece. In later edition, based on improvisation made by Marco Ramely. In his own words, he likes to use a composition as a reflection. He said, "I really like to use the composition as a way of thinking, reflecting something." Ramely still uses the opportunity to be inspired by others to expand the potential of both characteristics in one person. Other guitarist composer which I can speak with is Annette Cruzbink, guitarist composer from Netherlands. What is very important for her, also in composing and also in interpreting a piece, is a form. For her, a bad sign of form in composition is when the listener wants to end listening after a few minutes, or vice versa. It's too short for the presented material. She considers the form to be universal, not individual. That's interesting. Cruzbink also successfully avoid guitar schematism due to an approach where the pieces are not inspired by just one technique or one principle. Also, form is important in interpretation, placing emphasis on the course of the composition. She considers that the ascending course to the top of the piece and shorter and steeper course towards the end of the piece to be ideal. She considers the proportionally balanced course to the top of this piece and then a gradual course to the end to be incorrect in form. It is important for her to keep not only the attention of the listener but also the attention of the performer. Most of the works are dedicated or composed for a certain occasion or a specific performer also. Cruzbink gave the example of chamber music where one part is very simple and other very complicated. Each part should be written as a challenge for the performer, or in the opposite way as a gameplay for example for amateur guitarist can also be who can also be involved in the interpretation process. The goal of this challenge is to keep the player active. Cruzbink uses these didactic principles in composing for different performers. For example, she has to wrote a piece for a winner of the competition at the festival in Nordhorn. She decided to write a slow and very contemplative piece, opposed to writing a virtuoso song that will show the player's brilliantly mastered technical craft. This is very interesting that the composer-performer often deals with and is influenced in his compositions by the characteristics of the performer. At the end of interview with her, she encouraged us to discover non-guitarists composer in an effort to avoid guitaristic skills in composition. This means that sometimes composer and performer tries to incorporate all the things he can play into his composition. Her vision of achieving the highest creativity lies not only in the abstract thinking, but mainly in the good craftsmanship of the composer. Cruzbink is a very good example of an author who tries to avoid stereotypes in composing for the guitar, while maintaining a sophistication of her modern way of expression. At the end of my presentation, I will say that I'm very thankful to the organizers of this conference that I can share with you some information about my dissertation thesis. And in the very end, I attached two pieces. One piece is made by a composer who is also performer, guitarist, and the second piece is kind of part of my dissertation thesis, and it was made by non-guitaristic composer, which I collaborate on in the creation process. Thank you very much.